Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening to this edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. My name is Dan Johnson. I'm going to be your bandit for the day. And joining me for this very special edition of the show are two gentlemen, Jim Amish and Eric Nolen-Weathington. These gentlemen have written a brand new book that's coming out from Tomorrow's Publications called Jim Aparo, Brave and Bold Artist. Now, for those of you who are probably not familiar with that name, Jim Aparo was one of the leading artists for Batman during the Bronze Age. In fact, there are many that consider Aparo to be the Batman artist. In fact, that's my personal opinion. For me, Aparo was my Batman artist growing up. Uh, Jim and Eric have written this book, and it covers his career not only working on Batman, but also working for other characters at DC Comics and for other publishers as well. Um, the book is very insightful. It offers a great history of the man's work, but also a glimpse of the man himself. Um, I think you're going to find it to be a very enlightening interview today. And like I said, you're going to find out a lot about Aparo. Um, Also, Jim and Eric have written other books for Tomorrows as well, including Carmine Infantino, penciler, publisher, provocateur, Matt Baker, The Art of Glamour, and also Sal Buscema, Comics Fast and Furious artist. With the recent passing of Sal, I thought this would be a good opportunity to reflect on his career. And given the fact that Jim and Eric literally wrote a book on this guy, I think you'll find that they're the perfect men to talk to. So anyway, sit back, relax, and enjoy this very special edition of Dollar Bin Bandit. And joining me today are two gentlemen. Um, I've known them for quite some time. One of them I've known, we were just talking about this, over 40 years. Mr. Jim Amish and Eric Nolen-Weathington,
Withington.
who reminded me that we met at HeroesCon 15 years ago. And I do apologize there for that. I'm
No problem.
uh,
It's one of that's one of those shows where you meet so many people at some, it was a brief kind of thing, 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe, and
Yeah.
yeah,
I was going to say sometimes the brain don't work too well. The wiring gets a
yeah,
little screwed up. And
yeah.
by the way, if I start repeating myself, just say, Dan, you're repeating yourself, and we'll move on because I do that sometimes. So anyway, before we get started, I wanted to remind you guys that if I start repeating myself, it's something I do every now and then. So just let me know, just remind me, and we'll move on. By the way, before we get started, I wanted to remind you guys that sometimes I repeat myself, and that joke's getting old. I will beat that horse to death. But anyway, we're joining them today because they have a new book coming out from Tomorrow's Publishing. Jim Aparo, Brave and Bold Artist. This is going to be coming out on February the 18th, and hopefully we can get this out before we can get this posted before the book hits. Like I said, I was looking over the previous credits that you guys had done before. You gentlemen have also collaborated on the Carmine Infantino book, or Carmine Infantino, penciler, publisher, provocateur, and Sal Buscema, Comics Fast and Furious artist.
Mhm.
So how long
And
have you
Matt
guys?
Baker.
And
And
the Matt
Matt
Baker
Baker.
book.
Matt Baker, okay. That one I did not see online, so I will add that. Now, how long have you guys been working together? When did you guys first team up?
Well, I met Eric the year he started working for Tomorrow's
Yeah,
at the
at
Heroes
Heroes
Con.
Con is 2000. The year 2000 at Heroes Con is when we first
Yeah.
met face to face.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we didn't start working together until about, I don't know, about 10 years later?
Yeah, something like that.
Something
Maybe
like
12.
that. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Carmine was the first book we did together, right? And
Uh-huh.
yeah, I don't remember what year that exactly that was, but
I think it was around 2010,
okay.
2009. Because that started out to be, well, that's a weird, it's a weird story, because Carmine and he would call me 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day, because he was living by himself. He was lonely. He'd call me and Erwin Hazen and Joe Simon, and I Carmine would tell me things that were never in books and stuff. And one day we were talking about art, and I said, Carmine, I never heard you talk about your work and all this in the way you. So I said, hey, let's record it. He said, well, what do you want to record it for? I said, because we need it for the record. So we started talking again. It wasn't quite as good as original, of course, but then would just end up recording him. And then after a while, we were going. He asked me, "What are you going to do with all this recording?" And I said, Well, maybe we'll turn it into an alter ego issue. But the problem was there was so much material; it was impossible to put it in one issue. It would have taken three.
Mhm.
And Roy didn't want to do three issues of anybody, which is smart.
Yeah.
Uh, and then we decided to turn it into a book. And the same thing happened with Sabi Sema, by the way. Same thing happened with the John Romita book that Roy and I did. Um, the Matt Baker, a lot of that work was done already, and Eric and I compiled it and added a bunch of stuff. Um, but the Aparo book, that started with Eric, so that's something Eric will have to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Eric, how did what made you decide to do a book on Aparo?
Well, Jim Aparo was like my first fan artist, the artist, the artist I was a fan of.
Mhm.
I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I could recognize his artwork already, and
Yeah.
I knew it. He was the first one I knew his name. Yeah, I probably knew his name slightly ahead of Kirby, um, but he was the one I'd always look for when I was a little kid. And so um, when I started doing the Modern Masters books, um, that was in 2003, I think. 2002 is when I first kind of pitched the idea, and then 2003 is when they first started coming out. Jim was on my list of guys I want to do books on, and I was like, well, I kind of want to do something. I don't want to necessarily put him in the Modern Master series. I want to do something special with him because he was, like I said, my first favorite artist. Um,
I well, I was gonna say, Apparel for me was there are certain artists I always associate with certain superheroes. Like Kurt Swan's always my Superman artist.
mhm.
Irv Novick is actually my Flash artist, even though Carmine is again Carmine he created the character, but I discovered him to
Yeah.
Irv. But Apparel was my Batman artist because of Brave and the Bold, and whenever I think Batman, I always think Apparel. So
Yeah.
Yeah, well, when I was young, Batman and Aquaman were my two favorite characters, and he drew both of them at the
yeah.
time. So that was a big push, is why I kind of glommed onto him.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I was going to ask.
and
Oh,
yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to ask about how you discovered him, and of course you mentioned. I was want to ask both of you how both of you discovered Apparel's work. What made you fans of it? So Jim,
Charlton
start with
Comics.
yourself.
Charlton Comics. I saw
Charlton,
him in the Phantom,
yeah,
and then I
that's good
saw him.
stuff.
Then I saw him on Aquaman, and I loved Nick Cardy's Aquaman. Hard to beat. And then Perro came along, and I went, "Wow, this is great too." And I followed Jim from the night. It was an interesting thing because I used to do because my name same initials, and I used to do my initials the way that Jim did it. And then I
Mhm.
said, "Oh my gosh, I got to change it." you know, it's funny what you remember. But then when I started seeing him on Brave and the Bold, which I think was the best Batman book of the time period, and it was because of Jim. Bob Haney wrote some great stuff,
Yeah,
and too, and Boltonoff, who was the editor, pretty much let them do what they wanted to, within reason. I mean, they had a lot more latitude, I think, than Boltonoff gave some of the other people who worked for him, um, with great success. But yeah, Jim was great. He was my favorite Batman artist, and I was a Frank Robbins fan. I liked Novik's Batman. I liked Denny O'Neill and Neil Adams' Batman, but there was just something about Jim. I think it's because Jim was realistic, but not realistic. He kind of crossed the line between illustration and cartoon,
yeah,
and that made it. Well, I say this: as much as great as Neil Adams was, sometimes too much realism is too much realism. And I like
yeah,
something. I like something where you couldn't get into your imagination the way Jim Aparo could get you in, because there's a little distance between in reality that O'Neill, who was basically trying to be photographic, was doing. And that's why I think Jim work resonated better. I think Jim was certainly a better storyteller than Neil Adams, no
yeah,
question. And he did things I liked. He put guest stars, like in the background, like Columbo was the one I remember the most. TV movie stars and stuff. And I started smoking a pipe when I was 14, and I
mhm,
loved that Jim was the only artist who drew anybody smoking a pipe practically.
yeah,
And
yeah,
he used to draw these amazing pipes. and I never saw one like his. And I always and I start. It took me years and years, but finally one day I found one, which is this one. It's a car. It's a turn down, but this is a kind of pipe that Jim drew. You know, because it's big. Up, see,
Yeah.
and Jim always made sure that pipe was noticeable. I remember there was a Brave and the Bold with Batman and the Atom, and Ray Palmer's going into a building, and he's got a pipe in his mouth. And I went, nobody ever drew the Atom with a pipe in his mouth. And that, just, things like that were neat. And the way he dressed people, they look contemporary. He drew the most interesting ties, and I spent years looking for ties like that, and I never could find one. And when I became friends with Jim, I asked him about it. And I said, "Where in the world did you get those ties?" He said, "Oh, I made them up." I'm going, well, no wonder why I couldn't find them. Same with the pipe. You know, he didn't. He smoked. You know, he didn't smoke expensive pipes, but he drew expensive pipes.
Well, that
So,
was well, that was one of my questions I was going to ask you guys. If either one of you had contact with Aparo previously or interviewed them previously, and I just wanted to get your impressions on Aparo, what kind of a person he was, what kind of an artist.
well, I knew him. I knew him well. I tried to
Mhm.
get him for a convention, but and unfortunately, it was bad timing because that was when they were doing Death of Robin, and
Yeah.
he had to do the extra issue and all this sort of thing. And we became friends almost immediately because he was such a nice man,
Mhm.
very friendly. He was very shy, but if you talked to him enough, he would open up, and if he liked you, and you know, and it wasn't hard for him to like somebody. He liked everybody really, or at least most everybody. And Jim just was a social person, but he kept it inside until he felt comfortable. And once
Yeah.
he felt comfortable, he was social. He was funny. He had a nice laugh, and he laughed very easily. I could make him laugh even with my jokes. but um, but he just was a wonderful person. He cared about other people. He loved Batman. Certainly, of all the characters he did, he loved Batman the most, and I think that's obvious. And you could tell it in the way he did it.
Yeah.
And that's no slight to the others because his Spectre, you know, was incredibly wonderful. In fact, everything he did was wonderful. I can't think of a bad Jim Aparo job. You know,
No.
I don't think there is one. Um, but Jim was dedicated to his craft, and we talked about all kinds of things. A lot of our talks on the phone were just how you doing, just a normal conversation. We didn't always talk comics. We talked Star Trek. We talked a lot of science fiction because he was big into it. And but normally it was, you know, how you been doing, and he'd tell me stuff he'd do, and I would do the same. But and he felt bad about not being able to come to the convention, so he did a Batman drawing for me,
Oh man.
which you'll see in the book, by the way.
Excellent.
Um, and oh yeah, that was special and surprise. I had no idea, you know, what was going to be, but you know, it was Jim was that way. He didn't like to hurt people's feelings. You know, he was a sensitive man, and he was shy about going to conventions. But I noticed that when he did, he would open up. Somehow he ended up, you know, working past this shyness, and it really it really I think the shows really did him well to see how loved he was. I think that was something he really needed. I think all artists need that, all writers
Yeah.
need that, all musicians need that. And I think it really made Jim feel like his work was more special than he probably thought it was. He knew he was good, you know, but he was not vain about it.
Yeah.
And I don't think he had had an ounce of vanity in his being. To be honest with you, he was just a regular guy, and you know there's a lot to be said for just being a regular person.
Very true. Eric, how about yourself? Did you ever have a chance to interact with the Aparo?
No, actually, I did not. And this kind of goes back to how the book got started. Um, so I was doing the Modern Masters books, and they were doing pretty well, so I wanted to keep that momentum going. So I had, you know, a pair of book in mind that I wanted to do at some point, but
Mhm.
not part of the Modern Master series. So I just kind of had it on the back burner for a while. And then I think it was the fall of 2004. Scott Beatty, who was a writer for DC at the time. He's had some success with like the Robin Year One at the time and things like that. Pitched a Jim Aparo book to Tomorrow's, and John Morrow, the publisher, remembered that I had talked about wanting to do an Aparo book. He said, "Would you like to do it with? Would it be would you want to do it with Scott?" And I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." So, Scott had just had a kid born. He had just moved houses and everything. So he's had all his DC work. So uh, we had to take some time before getting started on the book. So we kind of had some conversations about planning it and everything. What we kind of wanted to do. Wanted to do a full interview with Jim. So he got in contact with Jim. So not me, but Scott did, because he was working for DC, so he had more of a, and he'd be the one doing the interviews. So it made more sense for him to be the point of contact. Jim agreed to do the book and everything, but we weren't going to be able to do it until the next summer. So in 2005, that's when Scott's son was born. Was the summer of 2005. So I think at the time we started planning the book, I don't think they knew they were having a kid yet, but and doing the house and everything. So in between the time we contacted Jim, all that happened, and then so we said, okay, after Comic-Con International, San Diego Comic-Con at the time, we'll start doing the interviews then, and that was agreed upon. So we were planning on starting the interviews like in August or September of 2005, and of course we were at San Diego Comic-Con when we got the news that Jim had passed away. So my wife was also pregnant at the time with our second child. So it's kind of a chaotic time. We were having to try to completely come up with some other way of how to do the book. Because like I said, it was planning to be an interview book at the beginning. Scott had a bunch of chaos going on, newborn in the house, new house still trying to get settled in.
Yeah.
He had some other things going on too. And then my wife had a medical problem, which resulted in her not being able to drive for a year. It didn't affect the pregnancy, but between the pregnancy and that and everything else, neither of us had time to do the book. So eventually, within a few months, Scott decided he needed to back out of the book because he just wasn't going to have time to do it. So for a long time, it was just me trying to figure out what to do. I still have my other Modern Masters books I was having to put out. So it sat around for a long time before, we had done some work on it. We had tried to do some things. Like I had done some layouts for him to write around, that kind of thing. But the only thing that really got done before the time Scott left was he had reached out to a bunch of different artists, professionals, to get testimonials and that kind of thing about Jim. And all of those are in the book. There's a chapter that features most of them, and then a couple of them are in another chapter. But so he still has a presence in the book. And then over time, my friend George Corey, who I've done a couple of my books with, came in and wrote 3 other chapters, which are in the book. He wrote a short chapter on the Neil Adams influence on Jim and how Jim approached Neil to make sure it was okay to kind of emulate his style a bit, incorporate some of his stuff into his work when he took over Brave and the Bold. And he also wrote the 2 chapters on the 80s and 90s Batman work that Jim did.
Very cool.
And then I got some of the writing done. I had written maybe 2 or 3 chapters, and brought Todd DeZago in to help me finish it off. He was able to interview Julie, Jim's widow, which is in the book. But then things happened, and he backed up. He had to leave the project. So it was a lot of starts and fits. So I got things. There were periods where I got things done, and periods where it just sat for months. And Jim, when did you come on? It was like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, something like that. About 3, I guess.
I think 3 is right.
And we were talking on the phone about it, and I think you asked me if I wanted to work on it. If I
Yeah,
remember right.
because I mean, we had your interview that had appeared in Comic Book Artist as as a chapter of the book.
Yeah,
Kind of made sense.
Yeah, about his Charlton days.
Right, right.
Right.
Mhm.
And I thought with someone else helping me get my thoughts together, maybe I could finish, get the push, make a push to finish the last. Well, I thought there was 2 chapters left. It ended up being 4 chapters. But
There's
Yeah,
always something.
and I had an advantage that knowing having known Jim as
yeah,
well. So
that
that
helped too.
helped.
Yes.
But when Eric and I were talking, and he asked me, I was obviously wanting to do it because I love Jim. I was a person as an artist, and so I was very happy to do that. And Eric and I have worked together for so long and so well. We've never had a crisis in all the time, all the things we've done together. And
Yeah.
a lot of people who are teams can't say that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it was, and Eric and I have this. It's an interesting thing. We have the same point of view as far as getting books done and what should be in there and what should not be in there. So we see things so much alike that it's very natural for us to work
Yeah.
together.
Well, well, I was going to ask about the give and take that you guys have as writers. How what is this? What how describe for the listeners your process, how this works out. I mean,
Well, in the case of the previous book, the Carmine Nassau book, it was my interviews turned into a book. So the only writing there was what I did because I always rewrite and edit my interviews and take out the fluff.
yeah,
Like if somebody takes 5 paragraphs to say what could fit in a one, 4 paragraphs go.
right,
You know, because you want meat and potatoes. You don't want a bunch of fluff. I reduce, and I'm a talker, but I reduced my talk as much as possible because you're buying a Sal Buscema book for Sal Buscema, not for Jim Amish.
mhm,
I don't think my what I have to say is very important. Is obviously you're not buying it for me, so I always try to minimize myself. On the Matt Baker book, Eric and I, had so much material that appeared in Alter Ego plus what we added that we didn't do that much writing. We did more editing than anything else.
Yeah.
When you say Eric,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for our projects before the Aparo book, I would say my only writing per se was like writing captions and sideboards and things like that, just very small things like that. So
but
I was there more as an editor and designer.
yeah,
okay,
yeah, and yeah, because Eric designed the books and laid out the pages, and I always liked what he did. So there was never I never came back and said you do this differently or this or that. Because I like we were in tune. You know, we're in tune as friends as well. By the way, we need to say that.
Yeah, yeah,
uh, and because we were friends long before were partners,
right.
and anyway, on the Aparo book, it was choppy in places because there were different people talking, different people who written, and it was really choppy. So I edited it and streamlined it to make it seem more like one voice, and fixed whatever needed to be fixed and things like that. Eric went behind me and checked it over again, but I guess basically used whatever I edited, as far as I know. Eric did the captions, of course. Eric did all the design work for the book, and then it's as good as it always is. Um, and
And I wrote probably 6 or 7 of the chapters.
yeah, yeah, I couldn't remember how much of that you did.
I don't remember exactly because
Yeah,
some of the chapters are composed of interviews or testimonials or a combination of the two. Like I said, 3 of the chapters were by my buddy George, and so yeah, that's probably like 6 or 7 of the chapters were what I wrote.
yeah, yeah. And then I had a few ideas, and I pitched it to Eric. Eric liked them. Eric integrated them, and
Mhm.
and it worked out. It worked out great, and I ended up streamlining it, I guess, as well as editing. I suppose I don't know how else to really phrase that.
Yeah, well, a
Uh,
lot of it, I think, a lot of the for me, a lot of Jim's biggest contribution for the book was helping me make sure I was on the right track. I guess not right track, but confirm that what I was doing was either going astray or was what the right thing to do for the book. So that's kind of what was a stumbling block for me a lot of times. I don't. This is the first time I've written this much for a book.
But
Most of my books are interview
yeah,
books.
right.
This was a little daunting for me.
But it's always easy to second guess somebody
Yeah,
else's work because you're not playing the game. When you can be more objective and see things that the person who is playing the game, didn't see. It's
yeah,
the objectivity is important. So that's why reason when I would suggest a number of things to Eric, and he some of it he saw, some of it he didn't see. We had an agreement on everything. We didn't have a single disagreement on any book we've ever worked on.
yeah,
But if I thought something didn't work, I'd tell Eric. Eric wouldn't do it, and vice versa. We would respect each other's opinion,
yeah.
and that's easy. See, when you have this kind of relationship, it's easy to do a project for the most part, rather than two combatants.
No. Well, I've
we
always
only
said, oh, I'm sorry,
we
go ahead, John.
let me yeah. I want to say this, but I didn't. I The main thing is anything I did was help make it seamless.
Yeah.
Yeah,
To help it make it, have a flow that worked. And that was all. That I think that was my biggest contribution. I don't, and I guess Eric might agree with that. But Eric had a lot of great stuff in place there. It's just like you said, he wasn't sure on where to go, and I was there to help out and be part of it. I mean, it's I think this book, as well as the Matt Baker book, are the closest to total collaboration that I think two guys are going to get.
Yeah.
well, I was going to say, from my own experiences writing, there's collaborations you have where you work with a partner. Then there are collaborations you have when you work with a friend. And usually, when you're in sync with somebody, when it's a friendship, like I said, you know what you need to do, but your friend also knows what you need to do as well, and it just seems to work out so much better. And that's the impression I'm kind of getting from this. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, Eric speaks his mind when he needs to, and so do I. And we don't get hurt feelings by anything. When you're working on a project, the important thing is to make that project the best that you can make it, and
right,
nothing else matters. Your personal feelings doesn't matter, and the only thing that matters is doing the best job you can because the reader is going to spend his money, and you want that reader to get their money's worth.
Yeah.
You
exactly,
know, especially when it's a book that they bought because they love that artist, and you got to give them the best that you can, and so sometimes in case of Eric, we know each other so well that being blunt never hurts anybody's feelings because we have a cause, and the
yeah,
cause is to produce a book that is worth the money and that represents that artist in the best light that he deserves and that we possibly can do. Because my God, who deserves a book more than Jim Aparo?
sure,
And look how long it's been.
Yeah.
And Jim, I felt, and I'll say this, Jim was always underrated, in my opinion, no matter how big an audience of fans that he had. And he had a wide audience of fans. I still feel like he was underrated because Neil Adams always got more attention. And this is no slight to Neil. I'm a big fan of Neil's work. I was friends with Neil, and so I'm not trying to badmouth him. But what I'm saying is Neil got a lot of attention, and it was easy for Neil to get a lot of attention. And DC promoted him. They promoted Jim in the 70s and the 80s, but not like they promoted Neil or some other flavors of the month who would come and go. And Jim, by his very basic shy nature, was not really one to go and publicize himself and go out and say, "Hi, I'm Jim Aparo. Come over here and see me." He was not that kind of man at all.
yeah,
So, and I think that he ended up not getting the attentions in the stage presence that he really did deserve. And Eric felt the same way about him, and we had an opportunity to do something about it, and we have done that.
yeah. Well, from my own personal experience, I think the best thing I can say about Apparel is, like I said, he was my Batman artist. but also Brave and the Bold was one of the favorite comic books I had. And whenever you went to the spinner rack when I was a kid, and you only had so much money you could spend, if there was a Brave and the Bold and there was a Aparo cover on there, that's the book I went for because I knew it was always
Oh
going
yeah,
to be quality.
oh yeah. I bought a lot of comics where Jim just drew the cover because it was Jim.
Yeah.
I'm sure Eric did too.
Yeah, I mean, I probably had more as a kid growing up. I had probably had more Raven the Bold comics than comics of any other series.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, oh yeah. And
Well,
when you have a writer and an artist on a book on a regular basis, that's a really good continuity that you
Mhm.
don't see anymore. You don't see
exactly.
a long career of someone like Kurt Swan on Superman or Aparo on Brave and the Bold or Kirby 100 and some issues of Fantastic Four. You don't see that anymore. And I think they try to do something new to continually keep your interest, but sometimes there's a lot to be said for continuity where
Mhm.
people are comfortable. I mean, if you're watching a TV series, do you want the actors to change every 7 episodes? A different actor in a role of that character? No, you don't. And
Right.
I think sometimes too much is made of too much change. That's my personal feeling about it.
Well, even when you're 7 years old, you like consistency. You like knowing. Well, it's like going to your favorite restaurant or going to a favorite. I'm going to say like your favorite TV show. You like tuning in each week. You like going there each week, and you like knowing it's going to be good. It's going to hit all the feels. And again, Aparo was that kind of an artist. He was one of those guys that hit those feels perfectly.
Yeah. You always knew what you were going to get from Jim Aparo, and that was quality. And you got good storytelling. That's why even when he would bend panels in different ways rather than a standard tier, say three tiers and two panels on a tier or something. Jim would break those rules, but when he broke those rules, he didn't do it at the expense of continuity or storytelling. You could follow his work easily, and there's so much to be said for that. And I think that was one of his greatest strengths.
Right.
And when you were underwater with Aquaman, Jim had a way of drawing the seven seas like you were really there. You were convinced. You
Mhm.
were able to suspend, your disbelief. Jim could do that for you. Some artists can. Some artists do it better than others, but the best of them make give you total suspension of disbelief. Jim could do that. When Batman's in the city, that's grimy.
Mhm.
It is, but when you needed nice, fresh, shiny steel buildings, Jim would give you that too. It would just depend. He didn't make everything look the same all the time.
Yeah.
And that adaptation, that ability of how to use texture, how to use the right camera angle and body positions of the actors in the panel. Jim would give you that in a way that made sense and that you could follow. And that's the whole thing about comics. You've got to follow from panel to panel to panel to the end of the page. Like each page is like say a Sunday page in a newspaper strip in a certain sense. But Jim would have a way many times when he had a good story, and he had a lot of good stories to draw. He had a way of by the time you got to the last panel of that page, you were ready to turn that page real quick. And
Exactly.
and one more thing, co- comic panels, unless except for sometimes when Keith Giffen would just draw a black line,
Mhm.
comic panels are separated by a white border. And in between that white border, your imagination has to fill the space. Jim drew in a way that you could be interactive with his work, and your imagination could fill that space because Jim gave you all the reasons to do it by what he drew and how he drew it.
Well, I was going to say I always that I think well my thing is I wanted to get into art initially, and I
I
found out
remember.
writing actually turned out to be my better skill. But Apparel was one of those guys that I would study his layout pages because they were so good. And the other thing, just speaking of somebody who appreciated the artwork, there are some artists that have this ability where you can have two characters in a fight, and it's the most boring thing in the world. But then you have other artists that can have a character just standing talking, and it's so dynamic. And Aparo had that ability. He could have a
He
scene
did.
with Commissioner Gordon and Batman talking, but the way he laid it out, the way he did the angles, there's a movement there. It's like a movie. There's a movement there. There's a flow, and I don't think I don't think going back about never saying about a Aparo page. I don't think I ever saw him draw a character where it didn't just seem natural but dynamic at the same time.
Mhm. Yeah.
What Jim could do was draw something like a whole page of, like you said, Commissioner Gordon and Batman talking, and not over dramatize it.
Hmm?
But he would give you the mood, he would give you the feeling, and he would give you whatever, he would give you the drama that it deserved and no more. And that's why you believed in it. You know, even Kirby could do that. There was a demon issue where Jason Blood was on a plane and he's sitting next to the guy who was the Howler, meaning the werewolf in the story, and they're just talking. But the way Jack used the language and the way Jack used camera angles and how he set the scene, it was interesting. Well,
Yeah.
that's a hallmark of a good artist who can take a scene that might look routine and make it into something without making it more than it's supposed to be. Like when Jim draws an interior, say Commissioner Gordon, who was a pipe smoker, here's an ashtray on that table on his desk. There's whatever a police commissioner would have on his desk. If he's in a house, and Kirby was great at this too. You had all the accoutrements of what would be in a house, and no more. Not exaggerated, but just enough for you to believe in it. That you yourself are there while you're reading it. I think there's just nothing more important than that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think in those ways that made Jim a realistic artist, because if you bought into what he was doing and how Jim was doing it, well, that's realism. It doesn't matter what the style is, realistic or cartoony. Once you believe, it's realistic. That's like I said, that's just my point of view. I don't know how Eric. I'm curious, Eric, how you feel about that.
Yeah.
No, I think that's like you said earlier about what drew you to Jim's art. That's what drew me to Jim's art too, was that balance between the realism and the cartooniness. It's that cartooniness that gives it that dynamism, that movement, but it's the realism that grounds it in, like you said, helps you believe in the scene. And he was one of the best at that balance between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And he was such a great fella. You know, I can still hear him laugh when we talk about one thing or another. We were talking about many years ago. They discovered what they thought was a face on Mars.
Hmm.
When I talked to Jack Kirby about it, Jack believed it. He says, "Yeah, yeah. It was obviously built by some kind of form of life storms and all this." And Jack believed it. I remember when I talked to Jim about it, he believed it and he didn't believe it.
Yeah.
you know, and we were talking about it, and I said, and I remember telling Jim, I wish I'd remembered this when we were doing the book, Eric.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd love to have put this in, but we can do it now. I said, well, Jim, maybe it's Alfred E. Newman. Jim must have laughed for a minute or two without stopping, because it
Uh,
got him. And that was the kind of thing. If Jim just played life as a normal human being, which I wish more people would do. All of us do it to some extent, but Jim was totally himself. There was no affectation about him. If something's funny, he laughed. If something hurt him, maybe he'd let you know, maybe he wouldn't, but he would feel it. He was a totally decent, wonderful person. I know I keep going on about it, but he's
mm,
gone.
I
But
understand.
the one thing I would say is I told him. I told him how I felt about him, and he loved me
That's
too.
important.
I had no everything I ever wanted to say to Jim. I did say to Jim, and I at least had that as a consolation when he passed. Because like Eric, I learned that somebody called me and told me about it. They saw it before I did, and that's how I learned. Learning it at a convention when you're working on a book, I know had to be tough for you, Eric.
Yeah, it was really hard. I mean, it was like a Thursday or Friday of the show, so it was like early in the show too. and so yeah, it was kind of tough.
Yeah. Well, what you're going to do? It took us years. It took everybody years who worked on this book before me to get it done. And it's a shame that it took so long, but things happened the way they happened, and there's just nothing that you could do about it. But at least finally, even if it's belated, it'll be out.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean part of the reason for it taking so long is because I wanted it to be the book. I mean, I wanted to be not just worth the money, but worth the wait and worth the expectation of not just other people who want to read the book, but myself. Um, yeah, so yeah, yeah,
Well,
You
that's
know,
that's
that's
probably
that's
the
that's an important thing he just said.
yeah.
For himself, because and it's not just a matter of pride or vanity.
Mhm.
But when you did your best work, you have to take a lot of comfort and pride in it, rather than just slap something out. And Eric's not going to slap anything out, neither am I. So we did a book that we ended up doing a book that we wanted to be proud of, and also make a book that people who were fans of Jim's or family of Jim's would be proud of. And it was as much quality as we could possibly put into the book. And so that's what Eric is saying, and there's no way to argue it. I mean, but that for us two, that's a motivating factor that can't be quantified.
Well, I was going to say I'm a firm believer that projects come together when they're meant to come together. So it's possible, again, it's possible it took some time, but it was meant to happen right now. Plus, two, the impression I'm getting from both of you is that you guys have done a book that is worthy of Jim Aparo. It's worthy of putting his name on there and saying, this is our tribute to him. And I think that alone is one of the greatest selling points you can make for a book. It's like you can go out there and say, hey, it's a wonderful book. It's really awesome. It's really cool. But then people will hopefully watch this and say, these guys love Aparo.
Oh yeah,
I love Aparo, so I want this book. So if that's the case, then God bless you. Hopefully we can get you guys some sales from this because that right there is the best testimony I could ever have gotten for selling this book to me as a reader. So
yeah.
yeah,
And luckily, Julie, Jim's widow is still around, so she'll get the book, and we just hope she loves it.
awesome.
And if she does, then that's a big reward for both of us.
yeah, definitely.
Well, like I said, again, growing up, I know there's so many people I know that are also Apparel fans, and I know they're going to love this thing. So, like I said, I'm like I was looking forward to it before. Now I'm like I definitely can't wait to get a hold of it. So
Well, good.
I did want to ask one question. I noticed that in the preview they were talking about how there was some unpublished work. What kind of unpublished work did you guys find when you were putting the book together?
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, a lot of it's photographs from family, some family photographs that his daughter sent us. I've got a drawing he did for his yearbook when he was in high school.
Cool.
Um, I've got but a lot of it's just kind of stuff that hasn't been collected, put together. Like a lot of his, I got all of his newspaper strip samples that I could get a hold of. They're in the book. I mean, they've been seen in various places, but not as one unit. And some of that stuff is hard to find.
Hmm.
Um, there's some like sketches that there's a couple of like commission kind of sketches that he had done that hadn't been really published. I mean, you could probably find them on the internet somewhere, but they haven't been published in a book or a magazine or anything like that. So stuff like that. The thing is, I mean, he had a schedule. That was kind of what he was famous for was drawing, penciling, lettering a 1 page a day, and he
Yeah.
didn't go beyond that. I mean, Levitz told the story of like if you wanted him to do a cover that wasn't part of his normal job routine, you had to book ahead of time, way ahead of
Yeah.
time, and he would do it if he had like a heating bill due that he needed a little extra cash.
Yeah.
He would do it on a weekend outside of his normal schedule, that kind of thing. So he didn't do a lot of drawing that wasn't for publication. So that's not a whole lot of that kind of thing, but there is some, and
Yeah.
yeah,
That's an important thing Eric just said because as much as comic books were a part of Jim's life, it wasn't his whole life.
Yeah.
Wife and kids, doing things that he enjoyed, just like the rest of us. He was very well-rounded man. And he had a routine for everything, just like a lot of us do in our lives. When to do something, when not to do something, when's the best time to enjoy this or that, and Jim was able to budget his life so he could do what he wanted to do when it was time to do it and when he felt like doing it. And there's a lot to be said for that, because a lot of people view comic book artists as people who just stay in one room and sitting in a chair and doing nothing else. But Jim wasn't like that. Jim would read, Jim would watch TV. He loved entertainment, he loved to be entertained. We all do.
Yeah.
He was no different than the rest of us, except that he could draw like hell. Tell a great story. That most of us can't do.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably one of the reasons why he was as successful as he was. He was able to separate the work from real life.
Hmm.
And a
Yeah.
lot, I know a lot of writers and artists who can't do that. They focus just on their craft alone, and yeah, you got to get some balance. I say that as myself. I say that knowing my personal life, and I'm like, but yeah, you do need to find a balance. You need to strike a chord where you can just step away from the drawing board or the typewriter or laptop and just be a human being. Just be yourself. Be something more than just
Right,
a creator. So,
Mhm.
right,
yeah,
right. But he was able to take his inner fantasies and put them on paper. A lot of people don't ever get that chance. And then and a lot of
Yeah.
people who get that chance don't know how to channel it in a way that it's them on that page. It's their feelings on that page.
yeah,
You see it in every panel that Jim did. You see it the same is true of a lot of artists. Kubert, Kirby, actually do a whole list of people like that. Harvey Kurtzman, uh, Jim could do that. He could put himself on that page. And everything
Sometimes he
you
literally
see,
did.
I'm sorry?
But sometimes he did that literally.
Oh, you're thinking of
yeah,
that one issue, Brave and Bold.
Well, he's done it. He's done it 3 or 4 times where he's inserted himself as a character in the book.
Right, right, and he was there he is having fun, not taking himself too seriously, and that was his way of joining in on the fun that he was creating for the reader, and he had that fun for himself. That issue with Sergeant Rock and Batman, where he's at the drawing board and all, is to me one of my favorite issues because it was so much fun and it was a nice break from all the darkness that were in some of the other issues. It was really a cool one, and a nice change of pace, I thought.
yeah. I remember. I think that was one of the first covers I saw that I realized you can be a creator and put yourself in the comic book. That was kind of neat, actually.
Yeah, Lee and Kirby did it a couple of times. In fact, I think Jack drew himself unconsciously as characters more times than he probably even realized. People do that.
Mhm.
A lot of times you see a picture of an artist and you say, "Yeah, I've seen him draw his own face in comic books many times." I've seen Jim do that, not just because he was doing a self portrait. Just I mean, what do you know best besides your own face? And I think sometimes artists tend to do that, and I think Jim was no exception. But he drew Commissioner Gordon in a way that you knew that was Commissioner Gordon and it was nobody else.
Yeah,
Some people only have 5 male faces and 3 female faces. Jim could do a variety of faces. He could
yeah,
do and I love the way he did his facial expressions. They always fit the scene. There used to be in the old days, you'd see artists who would draw characters talk and their mouth is closed.
hmm,
You weren't going to see that with Jim. The mouth is open for exhibiting whatever the emotion is of the statements that the character was making. Some artists are better at that than others. Kevin McGuire was great at that.
yeah,
Um, and but some of the other earlier artists, it wasn't that. They didn't do that. But Jim could do that. He made those characters look like they were feeling something.
hmm. Well, yeah, you bring a very good point that there, not naming names, but there are, like you said, there are some artists. They only have like one or two faces, and that's it. Yeah, when I'm thinking about it now, I mean, I remember there was one issue of Brave and the Bold where you had Batman and Superman together, and it's like some comic books you read it, and it's like except for the cowlick, you can't tell the difference between Superman and Batman. But yeah, for Aparo, it's like they're both about the same height, same same hair color and everything. But again, you look at it, it's like okay, that's definitely Bruce Wayne, that's definitely Clark Kent, or it's definitely Superman. Um, I was going to ask about some of the other characters that he did. What were your thoughts on some of the characters like Aquaman? I'll lead off with Aquaman just because of the fact that I always thought he drew the best Aquaman. It just I don't know. I grew up in that time period where Aquaman wasn't considered one of the hip characters, but when Aparo drew him, he was the hip character. He was really good.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask, we've talked a little bit about what he brought to Batman. I was going to ask what you guys thought about what he brought to some of the other characters. And again, Aquaman, what do you think he brought to it that a lot of other artists didn't do?
Well, for when he took over Aquaman, he knew that Nick Cardy was a very popular artist on the book,
Mm-hmm.
and so he kind of wanted to start out at least kind of emulating Cardy's style, and that's what he did. And it gradually changed. You can see it from every 2 or 3 issues. You can see it getting as Aquaman got. Just Cardy, his Aquaman was kind of a beefy guy,
Mm-hmm.
really solid, kind of almost like a Superman, like a win, like a Superman kind of physique of the top of the 60 Superman. But when Jim took him over, he took him much leaner because he was thinking he's a swimmer. He should look like swimmers I see on TV. And so you can see it as it changes. And then he left. So when Aquaman was canceled, he goes over to doing he was doing the Phantom and Spectre and things like that. When he comes back to Aquaman, he's been on Brave and the Bold. He's got that Neil Adams influence now. So now his Aquaman looks a little bit more in keeping with Neil Adams' take on the character. So that's kind of when what the Aquaman we know of him. That's when it kind of becomes fully formed. Where I call it the final form.
Yeah.
It's kind of a Dragon Ball Z thing. It's kind of his final form of Aquaman from there on. And I think those issues of Brave and the Bold where he comes back, that's like the first time you see it.
Yeah.
And that's those 2 issues with Aquaman and Brave and the Bold, I think are like probably the best Aquaman ever put down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I was gonna say, I think the second issue of Brave and the Bold I ever bought was like, I think it was 144, was with Creeper. And again, for any youngsters out there, anyone under the age of 30, there used to be back in the day, you used to have these things called spinner racks at drugstores and grocery stores, and every now and then you find a comic book that came out a couple of months before that didn't get picked up, and I that happened with me. I got that Brave and the Bold with Creeper, but then I got the Aquaman issue before that at a drugstore about a month later. And again, that was the Brave and the Creeper one sold me, but that one was definitely the one because I'm just like, if this guy can make Aquaman look cool, then yeah, this guy's got something going on here. So
yeah.
Well, you think it this way. He created the underwater environment that was very believable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have Batman and Aquaman together, you've got 2 worlds coming together, and Jim did it effortlessly, and it was seamless. That's that. There's a lot to be said for that. That took thinking. Jim didn't just sit there and draw. Jim thought out what he was drawing.
Yeah.
And that includes the environment behind him, because there are some artists who are lax on the backgrounds, and you don't know where those characters are. Jim always kept everything grounded. You always knew where those characters were, and to bring water and air together the way he did with Batman and Aquaman and make it look seamless as he did, I think is really quite an accomplishment.
And I would also say, he's not just my Batman and Aquaman artist. He's also my Phantom Stranger artist.
Yes.
His Phantom Stranger work was just incredible with the way you can look at a page that doesn't even have Phantom Stranger on it, and it's like this masterclass in how to draw foggy nights in London or something. So
right. Yeah, he was great with textures. He wasn't. He'd use a crayon, or he'd use a razor blade, or he would take a marker that was partly dried out to to make a certain effect. Jim, really understood, textural arrangement in panels, zipper tone, whatever he needed to do to make it look like the way he thought it should look like to convey the essence of the scene.
Yeah.
And
I'll say there's a page from Aquaman 51 that's in the book. The original art's in the book. It's got 5 different inking techniques in on that page
yeah,
between the
Nice.
hatching, the cross hatching, um, the stipple effect he does, as a hand stippling, and then also like a bende pattern he's put on the page. It's an incredible page. It's where it's the storyline where Aquaman goes into that other dimension, the underwater dimension to track down Mara. Um, but that was just like just to see all that technical ability on one page was kind of amazing.
yes,
Nice.
I know, and few artists could match it. And that's another thing too. It's one thing to be creative. Lots of people are creative. Most human beings are creative to one extent or another. But Jim could take that creativity and put it into a form that you could believe. And he understood that everything wasn't nice and shiny and glitzy. Sometimes it was gloomy and dark and gritty. And he could just go from one to the other in one panel, and you're going to believe it. It's just he had a way of believability, even though he was not a photographic artist per se.
But now this is a good little segue. The other character I want to ask about was Spectre.
Yeah, well, Aparo was a big fan of the EC comics, so he really enjoyed Spectre. I think there was a time we got a little anecdote. I think it was one of the assistant editors. I don't remember which one it was. Maybe Darren Vincenzo tells the story, or maybe it was Scott Peterson. I don't remember. About going to Jim Apara's house. And he said, "Yeah, it takes." They were looking through his artwork, and he said, "Yeah, take something, take whatever, but don't take the Spectre pages."
Hmm.
Right, right, right. Well, I was buying adventure comics before Jim was doing the Spectre. Because there was a 3-issue Black Orchid series that I really liked. That was Shelley
Yeah.
Mayer writing it, and I think was it Tony DeZanaga who drew it. I can't remember now, but I don't think it was him. But anyway, and I was, there was some tote stories in adventure, but when Jim came along with the Spectre, and I knew who the Spectre. I'm older than you guys, so I was very familiar with the Spectre, but I was not. Well, I'll put it this way. I was ready for what Jim did, but I didn't know it until I saw it.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to put that. I was so enamored and so in love with it. And it was like, this is what the Spectre should be and had not been, and this is no slight to anybody who did the Spectre before him.
Hmm.
Because I read the Spectre when he had his own comic book, which was only 10 issues, and some of them were really good and a few of them were not. I'd seen some of the Bernard Bailey Spectre reprints. I'd seen Murphy Anderson, who drew a great Spectre too, but Murphy did not give it or no one. And this is no slight to Murphy, who work not only did I love, but we were very close friends, and I adored Murphy as a human being. But Jim saw the exact essence of what the Spectre could be and filtered it through his own perceptions in a way that was not only believable, but at times almost scary once you are into that story.
Hmm.
He took a Spectre to a new level that nobody had approached before.
Yeah,
And once
Murphy's Spectre was a superhero.
right,
Jim's was a supernatural hero.
right,
Yeah, you could tell that just in the way he drew. You
right,
could tell the
right,
difference just through the way they were
right.
drawn.
But once Jim drew the Spectre, there was no going back to the level that he elevated that character to, in my
Well,
opinion, anyway.
I was gonna say again, going back to the way he drew characters. I mean, some of Murphy Anderson's Spectres, he looks almost kind of friendly. He shows up in like
Hmm.
Justice Society All Star Squadron. I can't recall any panel Aparo did where he didn't look menacing.
Yeah.
I mean, he just looked like if you turned around and saw this guy, you would be instantly it would be brown trousers time.
I never had this thought before, but it just occurred to me that this because the Spectre is really an anti-hero. in a certain sense, because he didn't mind killing the bad guys.
Yeah.
Kind of remind me a little of Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows in a certain sense. Because Barnabas Collins had some heart of goodness, but he didn't mind killing the bad guy when he had to. And there was a certain amount of evil in the Spectre, as long as the good. And that's why I say he was an anti-hero. But Jim didn't make him evil enough to be repellent.
Yeah.
You see, he struck the balance. And like I said, it made me think. I never thought of it like equating with Barnabas Collins before, because that particular character was very similar in that old soap opera, in the sense of the balance, not in terms of how they behaved necessarily.
Well,
But
he always kept the actual violence off panel.
Right.
You hear it in the sound effect, one of Jim's great sound effects.
Yes.
Yeah.
well, did either one of you ever see the Brave and the Bold animated series that was
Yes.
on Cartoon Network?
I
If you
saw.
remember, Eric, you probably saw it. Jim, did you ever see the Chill of the Night episode they did?
No, I didn't see very many. I had no. I'm not a big TV watcher, and I missed. By the time I find out about these things, they were already off the air. But I did catch a couple episodes, but not that one.
It retold the Batman origin story with Joe Chill, and it's actually lifted from the. It's almost lifted from the '40s comic book that
Mhm.
the origin story. It's really great because I loved it because they got Adam West and Julie Newmar to do Thomas and Martha Wayne.
Mhm.
Ah.
But the cool thing was they got Kevin Conroy to do the voice of the Phantom Stranger, and Mark Hamill to do the voice of the Spectre. And what you mentioned about balance is you could see Aparo's balance in both these characters on screen. I know that the guys who did the Brave and the Bold cartoon were big fans of the comic book and Aparo's work. So yeah, if you ever want to see these Jim's work personified, that's probably the best thing right there because you do get that sense of menace from the Spectre, but that sense of calm, cool collectedness from Phantom Stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have the art style, of course, but it's like the tone of it, what the way they speak, the way they talk. And again, there's the whole thing with Spectre at the very end where it is definitely a vengeance thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, in fact, that's the gist of the story is basically they both know Batman's going to find the killer of his parents, and Phantom Stranger's like, is he going to become a force, continue to be a force for justice? And Spectre's like, is he going to become a force for vengeance?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if you get a chance to watch it, it's really fantastic. It's one of the
Yeah.
best. It's one of the best episodes of one of the best Batman series, in my personal
Yeah,
opinion.
that's a great series. That's a great series.
Yeah,
But yeah,
but
but going back to the characters, I mean, that's the thing. It's like drawing Brave and the Bold. He drew most of the DC universe of the
yeah,
'70s. So he got a
Mm-hmm.
chance to draw just about everybody.
Right. Right.
yeah,
I loved his Wildcat. I loved the
Yeah,
way he drew
Wildcat
Wildcat.
was great.
Yes, and when they were boxing, I mean, that was brutal. Those boxing scenes were brutal, and very believable, very believable. Jim liked boxing, by the way. Um, so he was able to channel all that. I mean, that was the thing. See, no matter whoever the guest star was, Jim could adapt their milieu into Batman's. Very effortlessly, very seamless. And that's just not easy to do.
yeah. I liked it. I liked his Plastic Man. I liked the
Yeah.
way he drew Plastic Man. And I remember there's a Christmas issue they did. It was
Hmm.
Merry Christmas from the Mob. It's a wonderful scene where Plastic Man's putting his hat back on. It's like he's stretching his body all around. He's stretching the arm all around his body to put the hat back on. And I think most artists would have just like drew him maybe like stretching out the arm, but it's just I think only Aparo would have had the idea of doing the whole wraparound body type of thing. So it was kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh,
My favorite Brave and the Bold issue as a kid growing up was the issue with Plastic Man and Metamorpho.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember that one.
I literally read the cover off of that book. The cover fell off.
Yeah.
I read it so many times,
Yeah.
and I got a page. I had to get a page of that in the book. So
Yeah.
there is a page of visual art from that story in the book.
I had
Well,
so many favorite issues of Jim's work. I could never just pick one. It's sort of like, Beatles. What's your
yeah.
favorite Beatles song? Well, if you name one, suddenly you think of five more. And by the time
Hmm.
you think of five more, you think of five more. Then you think of five more. It's the same thing with Jim's work for me. Um, but I think maybe maybe those early Brave and Bolds, which probably made the biggest impression on me at the age that I was, might be my favorite of what he did because of the age I was at when I saw them. And, it's one thing to be impressed when you're 12, 13, 14 years old. And then when you're in your 20s and you've lived a little more, it's a different impression by then. But when an impression is made on you early, that's hard to escape. It's like your first love. You can love six women in your lifetime and marry one or two of them, perhaps divorce them, whatever.
Yeah.
But there's nothing like a first love. And I think a lot of times we what we see first out of somebody is what we like the best.
I was gonna say I had an uncle that learned that you could love more than one woman, but just don't do it at the same time and don't marry them at the same time because
Right. Yeah.
well, I think anybody who's going to be watching this is going to tell right off the bat, yeah, you guys are definitely fans of Aparo, friends of Aparo as well. I wanted to ask, while you were doing the book, was there anything that you discovered about the man that took you by surprise? Was there something that you did not know about him that made you just stop and say, "Wow, my respect level for this guy just went up several notches because of what I found out, or just something that you didn't know about him that you were just like that you would say, yeah, that was definitely Jim."
Go ahead, Eric.
I'm trying to think of one. I'm not sure if I'm not sure I can think of one.
Well, I was just say this then while he's thinking. Um, don't hurt yourself, Eric.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
See, I told you, Dan. Dan, we
yeah.
like to razz each other a little bit.
That's okay.
I I didn't see anything in there that I found. I mean, there's some stories that I had not heard, that I didn't know,
Right.
but it was nothing unexpected because I knew Jim, pretty well, and I think it would have been hard for much of anything he would have done to surprise me because Jim was not a man to act out a character.
Yeah.
You see, and because he wasn't, it would be hard for anyone who knew him to be surprised, I think.
Well, may I should rephrase it. Are there any stories that you had not heard about Jim that
Several of
will
them,
surprise?
the editors had said I didn't know. Um, but some of the inner workings of Jim at DC, was stuff that I didn't, know because Jim and I didn't talk about that often. Sometimes we did, and
Mhm.
whatever we did, it's hard to remember, all these years later, of course.
Hmm.
But I don't remember too many stories in some of the detail that's in the book.
Okay.
And I'm glad that those details are in the book because it gives the reader, a sense of being there with Jim and the editor or whoever Jim was with who tells the story. So I think that's something that some biographies, lack, and I'm glad that ours has it.
Eric, what about yourself? Anything that you
Yeah,
discovered
I
about
mean,
him?
there were definitely things that I didn't know specifics on. Yeah, I'd heard a lot of stories over the years from people because I've talked to people who were either fans of him or, who professionals, that is, who were fans of him or had worked with him in some capacity. So I knew a fair amount, and then I never heard anyone say a bad word about it so I knew his
Right.
character
Right.
ahead of time. So there's nothing that surprised me, but there were definitely some things, details that I hadn't been aware of before.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right. You won't find anybody say anything negative about Jim.
you know.
Maybe there's somebody who might not like his art as much as someone else, but as a human being, you won't find anyone that will say anything negative. And if you do,
Yeah.
run from them because they're not the sort of person you'd want to be around.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, he didn't go into the after the first year or two, he did not go into the DC offices very often at all.
Right.
So he didn't really interact with people. He didn't do a whole lot of conventions. He did a few local kind of things, and occasionally something out of town. But most of he didn't have a whole lot of interactions with just the general comic population.
Yeah.
That's true. When he went to the San Diego con to get the Ink Pot Award, and I told him I was going, he said, "Thank God there'll be somebody there I know." And we spent all our time together. I think I ate every meal with him but one, maybe two. And we had a wonderful time. I got to introduce him to Walt Simonson. That was a particular, great moment for me because those two really admired each other.
Nice.
And that was we were Jim and my friend Ed and I were walking to a restaurant, and Walt and Weezy are coming up, and I saw them and I introduced them. They had a wonderful conversation. It was a mutual admiration society for about 5 or 10 minutes or so that they talked. And I invited the Simonsons to come eat with us, but they had already eaten, unfortunately, because it would have been great to have them with us. Uh, so I
Completely
felt really
cool.
good. Jim must have talked about that meeting for 20, 30 minutes. Because he just loved Walt Simonson's work,
Nice.
like most of the rest of us do. And that kind of meeting was special. But Jim was afraid to get on an airplane. He didn't like to fly,
Hmm.
and so he was very nervous about it. And knowing I was going to be there, made him feel comfortable about going. And of course, I felt good that he felt that way. I
Yeah.
remember he did go to a Chicago show, and again he says, "Jim, are you going to go?" And I said, "Nah, I can't. I can't go." And he said, "Oh darn." And but he went, and he ended up having a good time. And he really appreciated how people treated him. Everybody treated Jim well, everywhere he went, because he's just a humble sort of guy who you could just like immediately. He was immediately likable.
Yeah. Well, like I said, as someone who was a lifelong fan of his artwork and the comics he did, it's wonderful to hear these stories about this guy. You never want to hear your heroes were the kind of guys that would kick puppies or steal candy from babies or anything like that. But no, and again, this is part of the reason why I want to pick up the book now, because it does give me a new appreciation just to find out just how well, first of all, to find out he was an EC fan to begin with.
Mhm.
So, and I'm thinking, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm thinking to myself, what EC stories would he have done best? I'm thinking he would have been like shock suspense stories would have been fantastic.
Yeah,
Well,
the crime stories. I think he would have been best at, but he could do science fiction exceptionally well. But I think he
Oh yeah,
liked the science fiction better. He liked the crime.
why
and
not?
he did try to get work at EC
That's
before
right.
they closed down. So
Right.
he didn't quite get in the door, but
Was a
he
giant
did,
nerd. I mean,
he did get briefly meet Reed Crandall while he was there.
Yes.
nice.
Yes. I
So
wish I
Did
could
he,
have met Reed Crandall.
that would have been, dude, that would have been awesome. Now I've got to ask, did he ever share any of the stories about meeting any of the EC guys besides Reed, or any of
No.
the others, or no?
No. We,
I don't, I think that besides that, he didn't really meet anybody. Maybe
no,
at
I don't, I
fan stuff,
don't,
maybe.
I think Eric's right. I don't recall him saying anything beyond Reed Crandall, but he loved those books and he'd talk about them. And he loved Graham Ingalls. He said that stuff was spooky. It was scary.
Yeah,
And he loved the lines because it was a cross between comic books and pulps, the way Ingalls drew. And that really drew Jim in. I think Reed Crandall, his use, he was an illustrator more than a storyteller,
mhm.
but his use of black and white and in gray areas were unmatched in Crandall's time, and I think Jim learned from that. I think Jim learned a lot from that, and I think everything about the EC comics were an influence to Jim, even Jack Davis. And sometimes, if you look at some of his Charlton work, you can see just a little bit of Jack Davis thinking in there. That kind of interactive attitude the characters had.
Yeah,
Um, but by the time he was influenced by Adams, then that becomes essentially a foundation, and he lets go of that previous foundation. You see, that's the step up that most artists have to make at one time or another. I mean, if you look at Jack Kirby, he was heavily influenced, and you could see it from beginning to end by Milton Caniff. He never
mhm.
lost the Caniff influence. Uh, he would place blacks in the same places as Kniff did, but the shapes would be different. You see, things like that. Well, Jim was no exception. He would do that too. You could see some Hal Foster and Alex Raymond in Jim's work, but in a way, he synthesized what they did into his own voice, into his own way of viewing things to present to the reader. So you wouldn't look at it necessarily and think Hal Foster or Alex Raymond or Neil Adams maybe Neil Adams a little bit, but generally not, because he was able to synthesize what impressed him. and put it all together into a unique style. And that's hard to do.
Well, plus also I'm just being a giant nerd. I'm excited to find out he was a Star Trek fan. That
Oh
just makes
yes,
that makes me
he was
that makes me happy.
he could tell you about every episode. Same with the Next Generation too. he
Now,
didn't
now,
like he didn't like Voyager as much as I recall, and he liked Deep Space Nine, but definitely the original series was his favorite.
now I want a Star Trek comic book drawn by Jim Aparo because that
That
one
would have been
was
cool.
just so amazing.
He would have loved it.
Yeah.
Oh man.
He would have loved it. Yeah, I hate that we missed that. That we didn't. He didn't get to do that.
Well,
I think he'd have done anything for that if he'd had the opportunity.
well, I'm a firm believer in the multiverse. I'm a firm believer that in all possibilities are played out in all realities somewhere in the cosmos. So maybe out there's an alternate universe where Jim got to do a Star Trek comic book, and there's a Greensboro convention that he got to come to, and I got to meet him in person and thank him for all the wonderful stories.
Yeah, I wish I could have got him to come, but he just couldn't make it after that. He was also shy too. But he liked me enough, thank God, that I almost got him to come. But just didn't quite manage it. But I got friendship out of it, and in all honesty, I'd have rather had that friendship than to have him as a guest. So
Well,
he
that's
when we were working on the book, sometimes I was hearing his voice in my head. Uh, and I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it because I could still hear how he sounded. And that was something unique for me because the other people, Carmine and Sal, were still alive,
mhm,
and so their voices were obviously in my head. But Jim was long gone, unfortunately, but I could still hear him.
well,
By the way, when Erica mentions sound effects, a question I used to always ask artists is, did you hear the sound effects in your head when you're drawing? Kirby always did. Alex and Toth never did. Kubert never did, but Jim did.
yeah.
So I wanted to get that out there because that tells you how invested he was, in what he was doing, that he actually heard the noises in his head while he drew the scenes.
I think it was one of the writers he worked with on Batman. I can't remember if it was Jim Starlin or if it was I can't remember. But one of them he actually wrote would include the sound effects in the script, and he really liked that guy's sound effects. So um, he did enjoy sound effects.
Yes, he did. And I like the way he did sound effects because it wasn't like the 60s camp era sound effects, but he drew them when he lettered it, he did it prominently without it being intrusive. It was part of the composition without overwhelming, the drawing itself.
Mhm.
But the sound effects is, if you'll pardon the expression, because was loud enough for you to get into while you were seeing what was happening.
Mhm.
Well, again, the fact that he did so much of his own lettering too, I think that kind of helped because
Yeah.
Mhm.
again, it's you're not subject to someone else. Um, oh
Drawing
gosh,
over lettering over top of your artwork. He knew he could plan that out ahead of time, exactly where it was going to go, work around it easily. So yeah.
Right, right. Kirby did his own
yeah,
sound effects too.
yeah.
But he didn't do them like Jim did. He wrote the words down, but he didn't actually draw them to where they would be lettered. The letterer still had to put his own style on top of it. But that's not so of Jim. Kurt Schaffenberger was the same way as Jim, by the way.
Hmm. And again, I think that's one of the things that appealed was just the whole idea that everything on that page is just except for the words from the writers, it's all Jim Aparo. And again,
It's his inner emotions coming out for you.
yeah. And going back to what you were talking about appreciating his friendship and sorry you couldn't get him as a guest, I think that's the hallmark of any great artist is they always leave you wanting more. You want to be selfish and find out yes there was something else that was left over. that else that is out there you haven't found just yet. But again, we appreciate what was there, and again, there's again from everything I've heard, everything I've seen so far, I think this is going to satisfy anyone who's a fan of Jim Aparo. So it
I,
definitely
s-
gets my seal of approval. So
I sure hope so.
Yeah, me too.
We did the very best that we could.
well, I know speaking from what I've seen of you guys work before, that's your best is definitely up to snuff. So yeah, it's going to
Thank
be
you.
it's part pardon me for saying this. Anybody who gets offended by language, it's going to be a hell of a read. I'm looking forward to it, and it's going to be fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Now,
Yeah.
I did want to ask one. I did want to get off topic for one thing.
Mhm.
Um, like I said, you guys also worked on the Sal Buscema book, and of course, we lost Sal just
Yeah.
recently. I
Yeah.
just wanted to ask your any thoughts on Sal?
I think he was one of the most solid workmen.
Yeah,
Um, honestly, I would say that he never, in my opinion anyway, some people would dispute this, but this is my opinion. I don't think he rose to what Jim was. I don't think Sal tried for that. Sal was a workman who knew how to draw a good comic book and an interesting comic book. I think he it was more of a job to Sal than it was to Jim.
Yeah.
Jim, I think, was more invested. I hate to say this when a man's gone, but and it wasn't that Sal didn't care. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that Sal, well, he was in a tough position when they had him just doing layouts for books and stretching him out maybe beyond what it should have been. And sometimes he didn't have time, but just to do the story. But when Sal did have the time to do the story, especially later when he was doing Thor, and he worked on his style a little bit, you could see where Sal was more invested. And when Sal had the time and wasn't being forced to draw a book in 3 or 4 days, Sal would deliver a product that had Sal Buscema in it.
yeah,
But he just didn't always get there was that long stretch in the 70s where he just wasn't given the chance, and it's not his fault. When you're a working freelancer, you take that job.
right.
And I know from experience that is. But and he did the best he could. I mean, but even the ones who was just doing layouts, you can tell it's Sal because it's dynamic, it's exciting. There's not a dull moment. You know, Sal couldn't draw anything dull.
Yeah.
He just couldn't do that. Uh, and he just was able to infuse action and energy, into everything he did, and it made him exciting. I mean, there are some artists I won't name, but who have great draftsmanship ability, but they draw the dullest scenes,
Yeah,
and there's nothing dull about a Sal Buscema comic book.
very true.
I think
Very true.
something interesting to point out with both Jim and Sal, they both worked as commercial artists for several years before breaking into from getting into comics.
Hmm.
So I think that's where a lot of that workman mentality came into play with them.
Yeah.
Is they're coming out of a commercial art field where you're working to work
Yeah,
again long hours, quick turnarounds on things, and that workman uh, mindset was already established before they got into comics.
that's right. They understood the importance of meeting that deadline, you know,
Yeah.
and they would meet that deadline with all the quality that they could, and that is saying an awful lot.
Well, I think sometimes too, some of the better creators are usually guys. I mean, you get writers and artists who come in and they're like they live, breathe, and eat comics. But sometimes the better ones are the ones who come in from a different angle. They come in from a different field sometimes, and they're not. It wasn't their primary goal to become a comic book artist, but sometimes the past experience ends up making them stand out just a little more. I think sometimes.
Well, Steranko was into advertising before he got into comic books.
Yeah.
And in fact, when he got into comics, he was doing advertising by day and comics by night.
Yeah.
So there's another example, and you can see how doing graphic design, would work into comics, as long as you could tell the story. But you can't lose the story. No matter how great your graphics are, because then you just look at a bunch of pretty pictures.
Right.
And I have to have the story first. The story is the most important thing in a comic book. You can have the greatest artwork in the world, but if you got a lame story or something, it's just pretty pictures then.
Yeah.
You can't save a bad story. But the thing is, Jim, Saudi Summer, I could name a host of artists who could take an average story and turn it into gold. And
Yeah.
they were able to do that. Like I said, you never saw a dull Saudi Summer page. You never saw a dull Jim Aparo page. You never saw a dull, I mean, Joe Kubert, I mean, every line was animated and alive and full of action. Just kinetic energy flowing everywhere. That's what Kirby's about. Kirby's about, you know, action hitting action,
Hmm.
and creating an explosion of kinetic energy, for the reader. Jim didn't do quite that action, but his action was more understated until it needed not to be.
Mhm.
You know, when it needed not to be, Jim gave you that, but Jim didn't overplay, and that was another thing about Jim that was good. He didn't do drama for the sake of drama. It was there when you needed it, and when drama wasn't needed to be present, Jim knew how to draw an ordinary scene and still make it interesting, like I said before, and that's a tough thing to do. You have some artists who want to make a money shot on every page, and
Yeah.
that's what so they can sell the original art later. Jim wasn't thinking like that.
Yeah.
I don't think Sal. I'm pretty darn certain Sal wasn't thinking like that
No,
either.
no, I don't think so.
Sal didn't have the time for one thing.
Yeah.
Sal was, like I said, a real workhorse, and even when they were working him to death, he didn't lose that quality. And that's special. That's a professional. That's a serious professional.
I want to thank Jim and Eric for joining us for this very special edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. And I want everyone out there to please consider going out there and purchasing their book. Again, the book is called Jim Aparo, Brave and Bold Artist, and it is going to be available from Tomorrow's Publications directly as of February the 18th. That's when it comes out. And you can order it directly from their website at tomorrows.com. Um, Again, thank you for tuning in for this edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. Again, my name is Dan Johnson. I've been your bandit for the day. And I hope I have not held you up too long. And if I did, I hope you enjoyed the experience. Anyway, this is me signing off. Thank you very much. Have a great day.